As said, my name is Kärt. I'm the conservator in the National Archives of Estonia, and I'm very honored to be here in front of you. And if you're not too tired yet, with your kind permission, I would like to introduce a paper conservation project called Conservation of Oil Paintings on Paper. This project was held in the Art Museum of Estonia during the last 3 years. And the main aim was to find practical solutions how to treat these extremely fragile and brittle oil paintings on paper, to understand the condition of the paper fibers and the mechanisms of deterioration. The main initiator of this project is Margit Pajupuu, who is also here with us today. In the focus of our project, there were 6 paintings by the artist Ado Vabe. In this presentation, I would briefly like to introduce the artist to you, also to describe the characteristics of these paintings, to discuss a little bit about the reasons why these kinds of works of art seem to be in such bad condition, and to point out practical treatments. We are also very grateful for the Professor Emeritus of Tallinn University of Technology, Urve Kallavus, who helped us to understand the condition of the fibers by investigating 3 paper supports of Vabe's paintings using scanning electron microscopy, polarization microscope, and infrared spectroscopy. And we would also like to point out that the work with oil paintings on paper is not yet finished. There is still very much to learn, and scientific tests and research are needed. Oil paintings on paper have offered a challenge for both paper and painting conservators for many decades. It's a work of art where the artist has painted either directly on the paper surface or on the ground layer. The latter imitates the structure of a classic oil painting on canvas, where the canvas is prepared with a layer of ground containing binder, filler, and pigments. This layer serves kind of like a buffer zone between the oil and the paper. The painting, what's painted directly on the paper surface, is usually much more damaged. The oil substance has seeped into the gaps between the paper fibers, changing its optical properties, and may catalyze the process of deterioration. During this project, we found that in the worst condition, there were works of art which had a very thick paint layer on a thin, oil-immersed paper, for example, a swamp landscape and the tree. In these cases, paper had turned extremely brittle and brownish. And in this condition, it was very hazardous to lift or move the paintings, not to mention exhibiting. It would have been possible on a horizontal surface. Before I describe our practical work, I would very briefly like to introduce the artist Ado Vabe to you. He was a quite exceptional figure in Estonian art story because he influenced the artist in the early 20th century quite extensively. Ado Vabe was born in 1892 and spent most of his childhood in a beautiful pre-war city of Narva. A young man, Ado, found his independence quite early years. At the age of 17, he went to work in carpet industry in Riga. His art studies began a few years later in Munich, and this had a very good influence on him because the city was the heart of avant-gardistic art at that time. Vabe was fascinated by the new and fresh streams of art in the early 20th century, and returning home to Estonia, he took this knowledge and experience with him. And he was the one who introduced the modern flows like expressionism, cubofuturism, and futurism to the Estonian Art Society. He became a teacher in the art school Pallas and kept close contact with the different cultural groups to exchange ideas and inspiration. His later years, he lived a more quiet and retired life, being dedicated to teaching, but he also kept on painting and printing, and most of his paintings of that time are impressionistic landscapes, many of them painted directly on the paper layer with oil colors. Vabe passed away in 1961, and although before his death he painted quite a lot, Many of his beautiful oil paintings on paper have exhibited very rarely due to their bad condition. It's actually difficult to say why Vabe didn't choose more traditional material like canvas for his paintings. In an interview in 1943 for a newspaper, he stated that there is a big shortage of art materials for artists. And it's obvious that during the war, art supplies were not that easy to get, and this may be the reason why Vabe chose paper. But it is also known that in some cases, paper has been even more preferable to the artists, especially for sketches, for paintings on canvas. Paper is light, it's easy to carry, is cheaper, and has its own specific characteristics. And interesting is also that oil paintings on paper are very often painted more freely with free hand, and that gives a rather different perspective to the artist's handwriting. In the case of Vabe's paintings, it's sure that he has not composed his works of art merely as sketches. These are thoroughly painted works of art. In the case of 6 works of art that we chose, Vabe has painted directly on the paper without ground. And in some cases, it seems that the artist has saturated the paper with oil before painting. Other cases, it seems that he started painting directly without any preparations. Here on the wall, for example, there is a painting Woman in the Landscape, where we can see that the left upper corner has a very small part untouched by the oil medium. And this was actually a good place for us to compare the untreated paper and the oily paper. And we were actually quite surprised that we didn't see very much difference. Professor Emeritus Urve Kallavus kindly helped us to make an investigation about the condition of the paper fibers. And it was very good news for us that the fibers were actually in rather good condition. Here on the left, there is 2 pictures taken with polarization and SEM microscope where we can see how long and quite healthy the paper fibers actually are. The other example, a tree, is an example of the painting what Vabe probably previously oil-coated. The whole paper surface is covered with brownish, darkened oil substance. And here are also microscope pictures of the fibers which show us that the fiber is long and presumably the degree of polymerization of the fiber has not fallen critically. And it's also visible here how the oil substance surrounds the fibers. And as the oil is old, brittle, this is what makes the fibers crack. Vabe's paintings are painted quite thickly. The paint layer is rather curly and thick, what gives a nice 3-dimensional effect, structural effect. The artist has worked with strong brush strokes and in some cases removed some of the paint to draw out thinner lines. We think that when created, these lines probably looked much more whitish as the paper became visible. And nowadays, as the paper has darkened, this effect is lost forever. So why are oil paintings on paper so problematic objects? First and foremost, it must be said that oil and paper are quite difficult partners. Paper is very fibrous material, it's flexible and it's dependent on the condition of the environment. Oil and oil color are also flexible when still in liquid form, but as they dry, oil forms a solid film due to the reaction with dioxygen in the air. If the conditions are stable, no problems may occur, but as the paper changes its dimensions for some reason, due to air humidity, for example, or mechanical influences, the thick paint layer may crack, become brittle, and the painting will be damaged. As there is no ground layer, the oil has seeped into the gaps, as I mentioned, and as there is no more air between the fibers, light doesn't bump against the fibers anymore, but goes straight through, and thus creates the illusion of transparency. The question still remains, does the reason for bad condition, brittleness, and discoloration lie in oil substance, or it's due to the deterioration of cellulose fiber? What is a result of several factors like acidic hydrolysis, oxidation, and photomechanical reactions. The research in Tallinn University of Technology proved that against all expectations, the paper fiber was in good condition. Only on one painting that had been painted on low-quality wood pulp paper, it was in worse condition. And we could even say that the fiber is sort of capsulated inside of the oil media. There is a lack of air, no moisture gets inside, and if mechanically not disturbed, the fibers may actually stay in quite stable condition for many, many years. Therefore, it may be said that the main reason for discoloration and brittlement is oil itself. In these pictures by Urve Kallavus, we can see how the oil covers most of the fibers in homogeneous and smooth layer, and how long and healthy the fibers inside of that layer actually are. We are convinced that more research on this subject is needed, preferably with the help of a chemist or a physicist. But nevertheless, we as conservators, we were in the situation where we had to help these works of art, to put them in a suitable condition for display. For many years, oil paintings on paper have been like in a gray area between paper and painting conservators. But we are convinced that the knowledge from both fields is needed. When decades ago, painting layer was more in the focus, then now we see that paper layer is very important as well. It has to be kept in mind actually that the paper and oil color are like one here and they are inseparable. It was also interesting to find ourselves in a situation where old traditional methods of paper conservation didn't serve us anymore. For example, the measurements of pH, what's the most common way of evaluating the condition of the fiber, was impossible to conduct due to the water-resistant effect of the oil. And here on the wall you can see how it's a painting a tree, and you can see how it looks like a little bit like a brownish plastic, and the fibers are behind this layer and cannot be reached with the pH meter. This encouraged us to think about other principles of paper conservation as well. For example, the water-based adhesives that we usually use. We had to ask ourselves, are they going to work in this case? And in quite early state of our project, we decided that as the works of art are so fragile yet heavy, the lining or consolidation of the paper structure had to be in the core of the practical treatments. And here on the wall, you can see how we treated all the 6 paintings a little bit differently to have the base for comparison and to find the best solution. And we understand that lining is quite invasive procedure, but conducted under the strict principle of reversibility, we see that in this case it may do more good than harm. But we also tried to find more alternatives to full lining as well, and got very satisfactory results by attaching Japanese paper strips on the edges and attaching the painting on a good quality archival board with the help of these. As I said earlier, Vabe's paintings had very thick paint layer, and also many papers had distortions. They were not totally flat. And we understood that in the case of lining, we cannot use the regular weight press, what we use usually in the paper conservation, because it would be hazardous for the wavy parts and the thick painting layer. We found inspiration from our last project, what was also presented in Riga in 2014, where we first use a regulated low air pressure system. The idea for using this we got from mist lining technology invented by the Dutch conservator Jos van Gogh in the 1990s. We, Margit and I, had a chance to get to know this method under the guidance of Alar Nurkse, the conservator of paintings of Art Museum of Estonia. This method is actually more complex, but in our project this time we only needed one part of this, the press. And here, to give you some idea, is a brief introduction how to build your own regulated low air pressure system. First, you need a clean and surface for table, for example. Then a wooden frame must be built with suitable measurements, preferably 4 times bigger as the work of art. Then, on a wooden frame, a thick plastic sheet must be stretched and attached with staples. On a plastic, there must be a sheet of non-woven polyester material, for example, Holitex or Remay. After that, you need plastic tubes with approximately diameter of 2 centimeters, and small holes must be drilled after every 10 centimeters to the tubes, and corners must be attached together. Then an engine is attached to the tubes. For example, the ones that are attached to vacuum tables in the conservators' workshops, or actually any industrial hoover or vacuum cleaner will do, as long as it's water tolerant. Around the tubes, some sort of fabric must be put to prevent the clogging of the holes, for example, pieces of canvas. Then, in the case of lining, a lining paper or a board is placed in the middle of the tubes. Also a layer of adhesive, but adhesive may also be applied on the verso of the painting, then the painting, and on top a sheet of Holotex, and on top of everything a large sheet of thinner plastic to cover it all. Now the machine needs to be turned on slowly by starting increasing the power, and at the same time the thin plastic needs to be smooth on the, gently on the surface of the paintings. And here, upper corner, you see how the plastic takes beautifully the shape of the painting. As the vacuum machine starts to suck out the air between the two plastic layers, the air pressure inside drops, and the normal air pressure around us starts to push on both sides of the plastics, and this creates the press, and it's even and strong enough to glue the painting and the material together. And this has to be like approximately 1 hour. And after that, work of art must be put under very light press for a few days to stabilize. This is the main idea. For conclusion, I would say that it has been a real privilege to work with such interesting works of art. And it was interesting to experience how the painting started teaching us with their complexity and different attitude towards our chosen methods. And it is very vital to point out that every work of art has its individual conservation plan, and it's quite difficult to make any generalizations. But one thing we can say for sure, that always follow the direction of the fiber when lining paper, even in the case of seemingly super stable Tycor honeycomb plate, because there are always some movements due to the moisture from the glue. And we were also very satisfied that the widely used traditional adhesives worked very well. We could even say that the best results we got with Glycol G in ethanol. But how exactly these adhesive forces work in this case needs further investigation. Currently, all these aforementioned 6 works of art have been treated and are waiting for framing and exhibiting. And this was merely a brief description of this subject. If you are furthermore interested, please contact us, because we are currently working with the article about this as well, both in Estonian and in English. Thank you for attention.